In our reading today, Jesus is at the temple, preaching to those who have come into the city for the week of Passover. The Jerusalem temple is a crazy busy place in this week leading up to Passover. A city unto itself, its inner and outer courts could accommodate 75,000 people, kind of the size of Wheaton. This outer court is known as a court of Gentiles, meaning Jews and Gentiles were both welcome. It is the place to exchange currency, a market to buy animals, and butchers to sacrifice them on the stone floors. The two inner courts are reserved for Jews. One is the court of Israel, the location of the holy space, which are only accessible to men. Next to it is an open, colonnaded portico known as the court of women, where both Jewish men and women would gather. It's also the temple treasury with 13 wooden boxes topped with trumpet-shaped bronze funnels, which were placed along its walls. The clanging of the coins when people placed their offerings could indicate the size of the offering. Luke 19 through 21 takes place entirely in the temple in this week before the Last Supper. I imagine Jesus teaching in the shaded porticos. He's not only turned over the tables in the court of the Gentiles, he is turning the tables on long-held assumptions and calling out the wickedness that is hidden in plain view. Luke 19:48 tells us that the people were enthralled by his teaching. In one of his last discourses, Jesus calls attention to a widow who is depositing 2 coins into one of the bronze trumpets, no doubt with very little noise. While the rich strut their noisy giving, she appears to be invisible to all but Jesus. The story of the widow actually begins at the end of chapter 20, where Jesus takes on the hypocrisy of the scribes before turning to the rich. Let me read this passage in its entirety, starting at the end of Luke 20. In hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. They will receive the greater commendation." He looked up and saw rich people putting their gift into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." Friends, when we read the verses in this context, the story here is not primarily about what we do with our riches or the importance of tithing. It's about the inherent dignity of an almost invisible widow who gives to God from all she has. Throughout the Old and New Testament, God singles out 3 groups of vulnerable people for which special care must be given: orphans, widows, and the resident alien. Looking at Deuteronomy 14:28 through 29, every 3rd year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year, and store it within your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows in your towns, may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you undertake. In Psalms 68:5, Father of orphans and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. And then in the New Testament, in James, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress. Now, in the Old Testament, children were considered orphaned if their father died. In Lamentations 5:3, we read, "We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows." My mother was widowed at 42. I became an orphan at 12, my brother at 10. This is our story. Let me start by telling you about my father, Gilbert Duplessis. I am the spitting image of my German Scots-Irish mother. So bear with me, I really am half French. If you have a stereotype of Frenchmen, you are likely to think of them as romantic and larger than life. That would have been my father. When he was happy, there was no one funnier. When he loved us, there was no safer place. He called me his little pumpkin, which I think had to do with the red hair. His political wit was razor sharp. He cared about civil rights. And having only an 8th grade education, he was clear that he expected my brother and I to go to college. But he had a dark side. He often disparaged us, and when he was angry, there was no place to hide from his wrath. When he drank, it was always to excess. His zombie-like inebriated states terrified me. We lived in the very north end of Chicago with no extended family. As a young child, my mother took my brother and me to Rogers Park Presbyterian Church, where she sometimes taught my Sunday school class. My father was a lapsed but guilt-ridden Catholic. He never went to church with us, but he was uncomfortable that we were not being raised Catholic. So he needled my mother most Sunday mornings as we prepared to leave for church. When a local church invited neighborhood kids to Sunday school, my mother thought it would be a more peaceful way for us to have biblical training, and I accepted Jesus into my heart when I was 7. My mother started to attend church with us, and much closer to his death, my father did too. They both accepted Christ as their saviors. My father's alcoholism finally did him in. Not yet a teenager, I did and still do believe that God, weary of my father's physical and emotional foment, called him home. But his death placed burdens on my mother that were too heavy for her. First, she was grief-stricken and uncertain on how to navigate this new life. My father had so controlled all aspects of her life for 20 years, it was as if she was 18 again and leaving home. Only this time, she had all the responsibilities of adulthood, including the care of 2 devastated preteens. Then the loss of our father's income left us in financial straits. We were a working-class family, my father a tradesman who earned a decent living. He was a tuck pointer who worked on the grout and mortar between the bricks and stones of Chicago's grand edifices. I suspect my father was very good at what he did, as he worked on the major museums here. We regularly went to the Adler Planetarium, Shedd Aquarium, Field Museum, and the Museum of Science and Industry when he was working on them. My brother and I are most likely the only kids ever in Chicago who toured the outside of these buildings before going in. But he hadn't updated his life insurance when he died, and after the inflation of the early 1970s, there really wasn't enough to take care of us for more than 2 years. After that, we barely eked by on his Social Security for dependents and my mother's full-time job as an administrative assistant. So as is common for orphan children, I wound up stepping into an early adulthood. Psychologists have known for decades the lifelong cost to children who are forced into adult roles too early. In a recent survey published in the Wall Street Journal, for adults who have a parent die when they are young, 40% recall frequently pretending to be okay so as not to upset their surviving parent. 63% feared their surviving parent would also get sick and die. And 66% said that after their loss, they felt they weren't a kid anymore. I would have replied in the affirmative to all 3. I was entering into an early and stunted adulthood. As a 12-year-old, I probably shouldn't have had to learn about applying for Social Security benefits, how to go about buying a house, and what it means to assume an existing mortgage. To manage the anxiety of this new role and its burdens, it's not unusual for orphan children to create protective boundaries, setting patterns of rigidness, rule-making, and in my case, although I never articulated it, deciding that if I could be perfect, I could protect myself. Prior to my father's death, I had done well on standardized tests, but was barely an above-average student. The year after his death, I earned straight A's, a pattern that would continue for most of my formal education. I held my high school record in the 100 backstroke and became the first chair clarinetist. I enjoyed all of this, but there was a bit of shamanism involved. I was warding off the unknown by making sure that it never got close to a perfect me. The National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect is a congressionally mandated periodic research effort to assess the incidence of child abuse and neglect in the United States. The 2010 report showed that fatherless children have significant higher levels of maltreatment in every category of physical and emotional abuse. My brother and I were no strangers to emotional neglect and abuse. Prior to going off to college, my mother simply was not emotionally available to either of us. Her brother often stayed with us when he was traveling for work. His attention was a godsend for my mother, who needed her big brother's support. But he saw my brother and me as a burden to his favorite sister, and almost every time he visited, he would criticize and belittle us. And in my case, he regularly gave me exceedingly long hugs. There's another vulnerability for orphans: sexual predation. Back in 2015, my husband and I went to see the movie Spotlight, which tells the story of children who were abused by priests in the Boston area. There was one commonality among these children: they had no fathers. As we left the theater, I was especially quiet, and once we were in the car, I told my husband a story that I'd held inside for 40 years. About 6 months after my father died, I was at a friend's house and mentioned to her father that I would like to learn how to play chess. He invited me back a couple nights later, and my mother was delighted to have someone teach me the game. When I arrived, his wife and kids were out, and when I sat down at the dining room table, there was pornographic magazines next to the chessboard. Then the dad started to ask me disturbing questions. My chair was not far from the kitchen door, so I said I wasn't that interested in learning chess, quickly got up and left. So where was God in those 6 years between my father's death and my arrival on the Wheaton College campus? Truthfully, God was the only thing that was constant in my life. With no earthly father, I turned to my heavenly Father, and he protected me through seemingly normal ways. But I see his hand in all of it. Without running away, I was able to spend significant time away from home. I swam competitively from the ages of 12 till 20, which kept me out of the house every afternoon and weekend. My mother found the money to buy me a used clarinet, and I would spend hours practicing in my room. Other free time was spent in youth group, Young Life, and my high school Bible study. I spent my summers at a Christian camp an hour north of Chicago, where I got to be a normal kid and adults poured into my life. During high school, I worked there as a lifeguard, meeting other kids who were going off to this place called Wheaton College. They liked Wheaton, I liked them, and by the power of transitive properties, I figured I would like Wheaton College. This is also true. I applied, got in on early admittance, and didn't bother to look at other schools. In those days, my father's Social Security just barely paid tuition, room, and board, another sign of God's mercy. While Wheaton was an oasis, it was also a difficult space for me to navigate, as everyone else seemed to come from intact and well-off families. I felt the shame of being different and tried so hard to wear the facade that I was just another suburban kid from a happy, rich family, until one day I couldn't hold it together anymore and broke down in Professor Rich Buttman's office. He was the first person here with whom I felt safe enough to be myself. He saw me as Jesus saw me, and that was the beginning of my healing. I met Stan Diddams my junior year. He was a senior. We met in student government. Your parents who are watching the streaming right now are like this. You all are like, oh, give it a rest. Got it. We married 6 weeks after I graduated. He has always loved me and has made a safe home for us. He never saw me as damaged goods, but thought my gritty background and pain made me more interesting. He also gave me the bonus of the extended Diddams family, a loving father-in-law, and our own 4 beautiful children. More signs of God's mercy. But just like any deep wound, I have scars that will always be present. I freeze up when people raise their voices. I can't tolerate yelling, and I can't abide bullies. The chaos of crowds wears me out. I tend to overreact when I see others being emotionally harmed. I hate the smell of whiskey, and I'll leave a social setting if someone becomes inebriated. I don't play chess, and I'm not interested in learning. Instead, I play a mean game of checkers. But this time also taught me resiliency. I rarely give up on things. I have a high tolerance for pain, and my brother and I have both wicked senses of humor. As I grew into adulthood, I began to understand that my mother's limitations were not of her own making. My over-the-top father had not given her the opportunity to grow into her own womanhood. While people in our church looked out for me, they were surprisingly uninterested in her needs. I wish that someone would have seen her as Jesus saw the widow, that in her grief, working full-time, raising 2 children with little financial stability, she still found a way to pay my swim team fees, show up for every swim meet and concert, and made sure my brother and I went to college. Like the widow, she was giving all she had. Around the time I turned 30, my mother was visiting us in New York City, and out of the blue, she said, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better mother." I hugged her and said, "Don't worry, you did the best you could." That was the beginning of conversations about my childhood that continue to this day. She regularly tells me how proud she is of me, how much she loves me, and how precious I am to her. At 87, she's also very precious to me. Living in a small town in northern Wisconsin, she was widowed a second time 5 years ago. This time, it's much different. With few expenses, she's financially stable. She hangs out with a group of women who refer to themselves as the widows. And she is at her small Lutheran church 3 or more times a week. On more than one occasion, I have watched younger women at her church look to her for guidance, and I know where I inherited a heart to serve others. My brother and I were estranged for many of our adult years as we could not support each other in our own pain. As he once told me, the idea of a family get-together sharing abuse stories is not his idea of a jolly family holiday. But we both married well, have wonderful children, and jobs we love. Now, when we get together, we are telling these stories. We laugh until the tears come, and my mother, sitting in the corner, spends hours smiling at us. We'll be together again at Easter. Within weeks of each of our children's births, I found myself with tears flowing as I rocked the little one to sleep. I was heartbroken that my dad would not be able to hold his grandchild. For all the tumult, I will always be Daddy's little girl, and I know he would have loved those babies. When I get to heaven, after falling on my knees before Jesus, I want to hug my Father. What I have come to understand is that this is not only my family's and my story, it's just another chapter in the story of God's abiding love. It is about his love, his mercy, his faithfulness. I am sharing all of this today because I believe that there are others here who need to feel God's love and redemption in your own family stories. You don't need to hold your family story in silence. You are resilient. You have survived this far, and you are a student at Wheaton College. You belong here. There are people all over this campus who want to see you as Jesus sees you. Reach out to the counseling center, the chaplain's office, Carrie Williams, your favorite professor, or you can find me on the second floor of Blanchard. God sees widows and orphans. He sees you. Your Heavenly Father loves you as his child. His mercy abounds. Thank you.